Hey guys! All right, today we're going to do section 9 and it is determinants with 3 variables. So you already did determinants with 2 variables, and so you may want to have a refresh your memory by looking at section 4.3 because we did determinants back then with just 2 variables. But today we're going to do it with 3. Yay! All right, so let's just go into an example. The test is going to say to solve using determinants. And so you want to make sure, super important, that when you're on this, doing this test, that you read your directions, because when we tell you to solve it using determinants, I don't give you any credit if you solve it a different way, so don't do that. Okay, so the matrix, or the system, I'm sorry, not the matrix, but the system we're going to use to solve this is 2x plus 3y minus z equals -1. That's your first equation. Second equation is negative x plus 5y plus 3z is equal to -10. And the third equation is 3x minus y minus 6z is equal to 5. So I highly recommend right now that you just double check yourself that you wrote everything down correctly. All of your coefficients match what I have, because you can go wrong so majorly. Okay. So remember that when we did determinants, solved using your determinants, we found the denominator determinant, we found the x numerator, and then we found the y numerator, and then we found our solutions that way. So let's start off by finding the denominator determinant. And if you remember from section 3, to find the denominator determinant, you use the coefficients on x, y, and z. Well, before you only used the coefficients on x and y. Now we've got this third variable and a third equation, and so we're going to be using all of the coefficients on the left side of the equal sign. So if you remember, this was a big D, and then you use these symbols that look like absolute value symbols, and the first column is a 2, a -1, and a 3. Second column, the coefficients on y are 3, 5, and -1. And then the third column is -1, +3, -6. Now this is a different way of solving it than what we did yesterday. Yesterday we used augmented matrices. And so, you had whoops, I did not mean to do that. You had brackets on the sides instead of these straight lines that look like absolute value symbols. Okay, so what you are going to do now is this. So here's the denominator determinant. If you remember the determinants before, we would have a 2 by 2 and we would multiply down the diagonals and then subtract multiplying down the other diagonals. But here's what's going to happen now. What's going to happen is you are going to, when you go to take the first guy, you're going to take this 2, and you're going to ignore everything else, and you're going to use this right here as your determinant. So we're going to take, when we do 2, and you're going to ignore this row, that column, you're going to ignore that row. Okay, and you're going to just use that little box that I boxed as my 2 by 2 determinant. All right, so what that means is, I'm going to erase the crossouts because otherwise I'm going to have a big old fat mess. Okay, I'm okay with leaving the rest of it. All right, so what you're going to do is this is equal to, you keep that 2, and now you draw a 2 by 2 determinant with what was left, the 5, the 3, the -1, and the -6. All right. Second step is to do the 3. So when I do the 3, what I'm going to use is I'm going to use a determinant where I ignore this column, the rest of this column, and I ignore the rest of the row, and my matrix comes from, or my little determinant comes from the other 2 guys. I'm going to erase the cross out so that I can see it later. All right, so what does that mean for us? The next thing I'm going to write is a 3. And I'm going to write the determinant, and the numbers I get are -1 and 3 with 3 and -6. Now, here's a super important part, and that is this is a minus sign right here. Super, uber, duper important that you remember that. Put a star. The middle one is a minus sign right there. Okay. Where did I get this -1 and 3 and this 3 and -6? I'm just going to circle it on here. I got it from here and here. Because what I did was I ignored this column and I ignored the rest of the row, and I got my determinant that way. I'm going to erase all these lines right now while you look at that. All right, last step is that I am going to use this guy, and when I do, I will ignore the rest of this column and I will ignore the rest of this row, and my determinant comes from these guys. And so what I write is it's a plus -1. So this is a plus, and then -1 because of that number. And then I'm going to write the line, and then it's a -1 with a 3. And the second column is a 5 with a -1. All right. That is step 1. Super important that you realize that it is a positive first times that number, a negative in the middle term, and then a positive for the last one. The last one ended up being negative only because that number in the upper right hand corner, this guy right here, was a negative. That's the only reason why that will end up being a negative. But the pattern is always a positive, negative, positive. Okay, I'm going to go to the next slide, and raise your hand if you need the sub to pause it right now. I'm going to go to the next slide. I'm going to rewrite what I have right here because I need to reference it. So right now I'm just rewriting what I had on the previous slide so that I can reference what I'm going to do next. Because from here on out, it is what you learned in section 3. So it's not too bad. The only difference is we're going to be multiplying these numbers in front, but that's all. No big deal. Okay, so if you remember from, that's what I had on the previous slide. If you remember from section 3, what we did to find the determinant was, and by the way, I'm going to take 2 times this determinant, so that's why I wrote the 2 out front. And then if you remember from section 3, we multiplied down the diagonal. 5 times -6 gave you -30. and then you subtract from it, multiplying down the opposite diagonal, which would give you a -3. And then we have a -3 times, and now the determinant of the middle one will be a -1 times -6, which is a +6, minus 3 times 3, which is 9. And then I have a plus -1. All right, well, I'm just going to write that as a -1 times. And then what you're going to do is go negative. Okay, that wasn't the color I meant to do. Come on. There we go. All right, so -1 times -1 will give you a +1 minus 5 times 3 gives you 15. Okay, we're almost done. We're going to simplify this. This is 2 times, when we go -30 plus 3, that would give you a -27. And then -3 times 6 minus 9 gives you a -3. And then a -1 times -14. And that becomes -54. -3 times -3 would give you a +9. And then a -1 times -14 will give you a +14. And when you add all of those together, you get a -31. Whew. All right. That is your big D. That is your denominator determinant. We're going to come back and use that in a bit. Okay. You ready for the next step? I'm sure you're all saying no, you're not ready, right? But ready or not, here we go. You can raise your hand if you need the sub to pause the video for a minute. I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide, so that way I've got room to work, and hopefully I'll finish it in one slide instead of having to go to a second slide. My next step is I'm going to find the x numerator. We did this in section 3. And if you remember, the notation for that is a big N with a little sub x. And what you do is you replace the x column, which will be the first column. Whoops, that should have been an N, not an M. So you'll replace the first column with the answer column. So same as section 3. With that, the only difference here is we're going to have 3 variables and 3 equations. All right, so I'm going to replace the x column with the answer column, which is the column on the right-hand side of the equal sign. So all of the x's get replaced with the -1, -10, and 5. The y column stays the same, and the z column stays the same. And if you remember, you're going to start off with using -1, and when you do, your determinant comes from here. So it's a positive and then times this number, but because that number is a -1, then I'm going to have a -1 in front there. And then it'll be a 5, -1, a 3, and a -6. Now we do 3, and when you do, you're going to use this pair with this pair to go inside your matrix, or not matrix, but inside your determinant. And then don't forget, this is a big minus sign, minus, because it goes positive, negative, and then the last one is positive again. So this time it'll be a 3 times your determinant of negative 10, 5, 3, and negative 6. Oh man, I'm going to run out of room. Darn, darn, darn. And then the last step is a positive, but then we're going to be taking this very last number, this negative 1, and I'm going to use these numbers for my little determinant. So that'll be a negative 1, and then times, oh, I didn't leave myself enough room. Okay, I'm going to write a little bit below it. And then it'll be negative 10, 5, a 5, and then a negative 1. Sorry about that. I wrote my numbers too big on the first step. Okay, so my numerator, my x numerator will be a negative 1 times, find the determinant, negative 30 minus negative 3. And then a minus 3 times negative 10 times negative 6 will give you a positive 60 minus 3 times 5 will be 15. And then we have a plus, but then a negative 1 times negative 10 times negative 1 is a positive 10 minus 5 times 5 is 25. And so that gives you negative 1 times, that's a negative 27, minus 3 times 45, minus negative 15. And when we simplify that, that will be 27 minus 135 and plus another 15, which becomes negative 93. This is your x numerator. Yay! All right, we're only about halfway done. That's it. We're almost there. You got this. Stay strong. Stay strong. You can do it. You are all incredibly bright students, so you can do it. All right, next step is y numerator. Why, oh why is she making us do this, is what you're thinking. I know. That's all right. You'll be fine. Y numerator. If you remember from section 3, we labeled this with a capital N with a little sub y, and how we found it was you replace the y column this time, so the second column, with the answers. So with the numbers, the constants that are on the right-hand side of the equal sign. Okay, so the x column stays the same as the original, not from the last one we just did, but from the original. The z column is going to stay the same, negative 1, 3, and negative 6. It's the y column, the middle one, that I will now replace with the answers. Negative 1, negative 10, and a positive 5. All right, so this is going to be 2 times some determinant. It's going to be a positive 2. And then you're going to have a minus, and then times a negative 1 times some determinant. And then it'll be a plus, but then it's a negative 1 times the last determinant. Hopefully that doesn't look too confusing, but I thought maybe it would help to see that. All right, for the 2, we're going to use this guy. So it'll be negative 10, positive 5, positive 3, negative 6. For the middle, the negative 1, I'm going to use these two, negative 1 with 3 and 3 with negative 6, to be negative 1 with a positive 3, and then a positive 3 with a negative 6. And then the very last one, we've got -1, and my little determinant comes from those numbers there. -1, +3, and -10 with a +5. All right, we got this. Now remember, positive, second one, you're doing the opposite in sign, last one, same sign. Don't forget about that, especially it's this guy that you'll forget to do. All right, so here we go. We've got 2 times. -10 times -6 gives you a 60, minus, opposite diagonal, 3 times 5 is 15. You have a minus -1. All right, so I'll make it a +1, and then we go down the diagonal. -1 times -6 is a +6, minus 3 times 3 is 9. And then we have a plus with a -1, and then -1 times 5 is a -5, minus -10 times 3 is a -30. Okay, so that leaves you with a 2 times 45 plus, because these guys become a plus, a +1 times -3. And then a minus -5 plus 30 will give you a +25. And so that ends up giving you, what, 90 minus 3 minus another 25, which will give you 62. That is your y numerator. Okay, we are almost there. Almost. You got this. You can do it. The last step is for us to find the z numerator. Whoop, whoop, let's do it. All right, you got this. Raise your hand and ask the sub to pause it if you need to check out the slide for a little bit longer. Otherwise, I'm moving on to the z numerator so we can get this done. So for the z numerator, you haven't seen it before, but it follows the exact same rules as the other. We're going to label it with a capital N with a little subscript of z, and logically it makes sense to replace the z column with the answers. All right, so draw your straight line. X column stays the same as the original, 2, -1, and 3. Y column stays the same as the original, 3, 5, and -1. And then our Z column gets changed to the answer column. So -1, -10, +5. Okay, so this is, we're going to use a 2 times, the rest of them is a 5, -1, -10, and a 5. Don't forget it's a minus the 3 times the determinant of -1, 3, -10, +5, and then a plus, but then it's a -1 times the determinant, -1, 3, 5, -1. So now this becomes a 2 times, 5 times 5 would be 25, minus -10 times -1 is a +10. We have a minus 3 times, -1 times 5 is a -5, minus -10 times a +3 is -30. And then we have a minus 1 times, -1 times -1 is a +1, minus 5 times 3 is 15. We are on the home stretch. You got this. 2 times 1, 5, minus 3 times, boop, boop, that would be a 25, And then minus 1 times a negative 14. So that you've got, what is that? 30 minus 75, and then a plus 14 to finally get a negative 31. Yay. All right, that is your z numerator. And then just like before, your answer needs to be an ordered triple. So here's your answer. Drum roll. You ready for it? All right, ordered triple. Maybe I should go, I'm going to go to another slide so we have room. Ordered triple is x, comma, y, comma, z. And you're going to get it by taking the x numerator divided by denominator determinant, comma, take the y numerator over denominator determinant, comma, z numerator over the denominator determinant. Makes sense, right? Totally falls in line with what you learned before. Okay, so don't forget the parentheses. It is an ordered triple. We found that the x numerator was a negative 93, and we found that the denominator determinant was a negative 31. Y numerator was a positive 62, and we're putting that over negative 31. And the z numerator was a negative 31, and we're putting that over the denominator determinant. And of course, you should simplify. This is a positive 3, a negative 2, and a positive 1. Yay! I should have done a sound effect of cheering because that was a heck of a lot of work. Yes, I know, it's a lot of work. Don't worry about it. It is on the test, but we probably only have you find a portion of it. Like maybe we have you find just the y value, or just that, this is obviously too much to do the entire thing on the test. I don't think we have you do that. I think we just have you find certain portions of it. So, but in your homework, you're going to find them all. And you got this. You are all incredibly bright students, not just because you're a student of Mrs. Bright, but because you are very bright as well. Yay! All right, you guys have a fabulous day and have fun doing this homework. Yay!